Wyoming Territory, 1883. The wind cut across the high plains like a blade, but Loretta Sutter stood still as stone outside the ranch house, clutching a worn satchel and staring at the wooden sign above the porch that read Kelley Ranch. She had never signed a contract, never agreed to be anyone's property, but the paper in Mr. Kelley's hand, stamped and notarized, said otherwise. "You can't make me stay," she said, voice shaking from more than the cold. "I own that contract fair and legal," Bart Kelley replied, leaning against the post with a grin that made her stomach twist. "Your father sold you into it, 6 months of labor. Cook, clean, whatever I say. You do that, or I ride into town and tell the sheriff you skipped on a deal. My father's dead. And debts don't die with the man." Loretta's jaw tightened. She had come west to escape a life of being bartered like livestock. Her mother died when she was 10, and her father had pawned her off to men with rough hands and worse tempers ever since. This time, he had done it with ink and paper before his heart gave out in a saloon outside Cheyenne. Bart gave her a long look, then nodded toward the bunkhouse. "You sleep there. Your shift starts at dawn. You work 6 months or you pay me out. I do not have that kind of money." "That is the point." The door slammed behind him. Loretta stood alone in the dusk, the sky burning orange behind the jagged ridges. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her toward the bunkhouse. She did not cry. Not anymore. She just sat on the edge of the cot and stared at the wall. The next morning came with a clatter of boots and barking dogs. She worked without complaint, scrubbing floors, hauling water, cooking what little the pantry had. Days bled into weeks. Bart never touched her, but his eyes lingered. That was enough. Then one morning, a rider came. Dust rose behind his horse as he dismounted, tall and straight-backed, with a rifle slung across his shoulder and a battered-brimmed hat shading his face. Loretta was emptying the ash pan when she saw him. He was not like the others, did not leer, did not spit. He looked at her like she was someone. "Morning," he said, voice low and steady. "Name's Zeke Kellan. I'm looking for Bart Kelley." "He is in the barn," Loretta said, brushing soot from her hands. Zeke tipped his hat and walked off, boots crunching gravel. She turned back to her work. The shouting started not long after. Zeke came back a while later, stepping quietly. She was scrubbing the porch rail with a rag, her hands raw and red. "You Loretta Sutter?" She froze. "Yes." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, held it out without stepping too close. "Contract's null now." "I paid it." Her heart stopped. "What?" "Bart sold it to me. I paid $500. It is done." She stood slowly, rag falling from her hand. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one should be tied to something they never chose." His eyes were dark and kind. "You can walk away now or come with me. Either way you get to choose." She stared at him, chest rising and falling. "You do not even know me." "No," he said. "But I saw the way you looked when I rode in, like you were ready to vanish and never be found again. I figured someone should give you a way out." Loretta did not speak for a long time, then she nodded once. "I am not staying here." He helped her gather her things, just a satchel and a wool shawl. They walked to his horse in silence. "What happens now?" she asked as he helped her into the saddle behind him. "Now," Zeke said, swinging up in front of her, "we ride somewhere quiet, somewhere you can breathe." They rode west, the land opening wide before them. She held on to the back of his coat, wind stinging her eyes, but she did not cry. They reached a small cabin 2 days later, nestled near a stream, surrounded by pine. It was not much, just one room, a stove, a cot, and a table with 2 chairs, but it was clean and his, and he had built it with his own hands. "I live quiet," he said. "I do not expect anything from you. You stay as long as you want." She stepped inside, ran her fingers over the windowsill. "Thank you." He nodded, then turned and chopped wood until the stars came out. Loretta helped where she could, cooking, mending, fetching water, but he never asked. Weeks passed, and the quiet between them softened. One night she caught him watching her as she read by lamp, his elbows on the table, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "What is it?" she asked, heart thudding. "I am just glad you are here." She looked down, heat rising in her chest. So am I. That night, she lay awake staring at the rafters, listening to the sound of his steady breathing across the room. She had never felt safe like this, never felt wanted without being used. Zeke never pushed, never pried. But he was always there, fixing a dripping roof, bringing her wildflowers, sharing stories about his time driving cattle down from Montana. She found herself smiling more, laughing, wanting. One morning, snow dusted the trees and she found him outside splitting wood. She stepped onto the porch, shawl wrapped tight. Zeke. He looked up, sweat on his brow despite the cold. Yeah, she hesitated. I want to stay. His eyes softened. You mean that? She nodded. I have never had a real choice before, but now I do. And I want this. He set the axe down slowly, walked toward her. I have wanted you to stay since the day you got on my horse. She reached for his hand, fingers lacing with his. Then we start here. He leaned forward, forehead resting against hers. Together. And for the first time in her life, Loretta Sutter felt like she belonged. The thaw came slow that spring, the snow pulling back from the roots like a tired breath. Zeke's cabin sat quiet under the pine canopy, smoke curling steady from the chimney as days lengthened, and the sun climbed higher each morning. Loretta stood at the creek one afternoon, her skirts lifted just off the wet stones, her hands cold and red from washing linens in the meltwater. She didn't mind. The ache in her fingers was honest work, chosen work, and that made all the difference. Zeke was mending the fence past the tree line when she brought him his tin cup of water and a heel of bread. He looked up as she approached, hammer paused mid-swing. You always come find me, he said, setting the tools down and wiping his hands on his trousers. You don't have to. I know, she said, offering the cup. But I like knowing where you are. He drank and handed it back, eyes squinting toward the sun. Fence'll hold for now. Come June, I'll need to ride into Laramie. Pick up seeds, salt, maybe a mule if I can trade for one. She leaned her shoulder against the post. You go alone. Usually. You thinking of coming? She nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. I want to see something besides trees and snow. He studied her a moment, then gave a slow nod. All right. We'll go together. They left at dawn 3 days later, bundled and packed light. Loretta had never ridden that far from anything she knew, but Zeke's horse moved steady and he kept close. The land widened, flat and treeless in places, wind pressing hard enough to lean against. They passed a trapper's shack half fallen into the earth and a broken fence line that vanished into sagebrush. In town, the noise and motion unsettled her, the clatter of wagons, boots on boardwalks, the sharp ring of a blacksmith's hammer. She stood still beside Zeke as he tied off the horse, her hand brushing his sleeve. Do you know many folks here? She asked, eyes scanning the storefronts. Some. Not many I'd stop to talk to, he answered, but the man at the feed store's fair, and I need to speak with the bank about a note my brother left behind. I didn't know you had a brother. Zeke looked down at the hitch rail, knotting the rope tighter. Wes died 2 winters back. Took a fever and didn't tell anyone soon enough. He was always like that, thought he could outrun anything. I'm sorry. He gave a small nod, then gestured toward the general store. Go on in, I'll meet you there. Inside, the air smelled of flour and tobacco. Loretta moved slow between the shelves, her fingers trailing across bolts of cotton, tins of coffee, glass jars with labels written in a careful hand. A girl behind the counter gave her a polite nod, maybe 18, with a braid as thick as rope. You looking for anything in particular? The girl asked. Loretta hesitated. A ribbon, something blue. The girl smiled. For your hair, for a memory, Loretta said, choosing one the color of cornflowers. Zeke came in not long after, a paper parcel under his arm. He watched as Loretta paid with coins she'd kept hidden in the lining of her satchel, money that had once been meant for escape, now spent freely on something soft, something hers. Outside, the wind picked up, lifting curls of dust from the street. Zeke handed her the parcel. Ledgers settled. We can head back before the weather shifts. What was in the note from your brother? He didn't answer right away. They walked past the post office and the church, boots crunching gravel. He left me the land, Zeke said finally. Said it was the only good thing he'd ever owned. Told me to build something living, not just survive. Have you? He looked sideways at her, his brow relaxed. Getting there. They rode back with the sun low behind them, the blue ribbon tied to Loretta's wrist. At the cabin, Zeke lit the lamp while she set the kettle on. They ate quiet, and afterward she stood by the open door watching the stars. I used to wonder if I'd ever belong anywhere, she said. You do now, he answered, not from across the room, but beside her. She turned. Do you still want me here? Zeke didn't speak. He just stepped forward and cupped her cheek with his palm, rough and warm. She leaned into it, eyes closing. Not just here, he said. With me. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Then I will stay. He kissed her slow, without hurry, nothing claimed, nothing taken. Just the quiet promise of two people who'd come through fire and found shelter in each other. And in the hush between heartbeats, she knew. She'd never ride away again. The meadow behind the cabin bloomed late, but when it did, it came up thick with yarrow and wild flax. Zeke leaned on the shovel one morning, sweat on his collar and dirt under his nails, watching Loretta carry a wooden bucket from the creek. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her hem brushed dry grass as she walked, eyes steady on the garden plot they'd cleared together. You think the soil's good enough? She asked, setting the bucket down by the edge. It'll hold if we keep the rocks out, he replied, glancing toward the row of blackened stumps they'd burned down the week before. We'll need to keep the rabbits off it, though. I can set snares around the back slope. I can sew netting from the flour sacks, she said, kneeling to loosen the soil with a hand tool. Not pretty, but it'll do. They worked side by side until the sun passed its peak. Loretta paused to drink from the dipper, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. You always this quiet when you work? She asked, tilting her head toward him. Zeke gave a soft grunt. I don't talk much unless it's worth saying, so say something worth it. He leaned down, pulling a weed from the edge of the row. All right, I thought about building another room onto the cabin, she blinked. Why? So you wouldn't have to sleep beside the stove come winter. Gets colder than bone in there. Her eyes softened, but she didn't smile. You're planning ahead. I am, he said, meeting her gaze. Are you? She dug her trowel into the dirt, slow and deliberate. I never planned farther than the next morning. Until now, they planted potatoes that afternoon. No ceremony, just the rhythm of shared effort. That evening, she sat on the porch step, running her thumb along the edge of the tin cup, watching dusk settle over the pines. I used to dream about a little room of my own, she said, not looking at him. A door that locked and a window that opened. Nothing special, just something mine. Zeke sat beside her, forearms resting on his knees. You got that door now. Yes, she said quietly, but it's not the room I want anymore. He looked over at her, waiting. I want someone who'll stay, she said, not because they feel obliged, but because they mean to. Zeke said nothing for a long while. The night sounds rose around them, an owl far off, the creak of trees shifting in the breeze. I never took you in out of pity, he said finally. I didn't see a woman in need. I saw a woman with her back against the wall, still standing. She turned toward him, her face unreadable. Do you think that's enough to build a life on? No, Zeke said, but it's a good place to start. She nodded once, then stood. Come inside before the fire dies. The next day, he saddled the mare and rode north to check the trapline. Loretta stayed behind, patching the roof where the snowmelt had warped the shingles. By midday, she'd driven in the last nail and climbed down the ladder, palms blistered, shoulders sore. Inside, she found the shelf by the window bare, Zeke's rifle gone. The cabin felt too quiet. She lit the lamp early and boiled beans with dried onion, setting out 2 plates by habit. Darkness came. He didn't. She kept the door bolted and sat in the chair with her back to the wall, listening for hoofbeats. When dawn broke pale and gray, she stepped outside, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, and looked toward the ridge. By late morning, he rode back, his coat torn and a deep gash across his cheekbone. She didn't ask. Just took the reins, tied off the mare, and brought him inside. He sat at the table while she cleaned the wound with carbolic and stitched it with careful fingers. "Couple of trappers," he said, voice tight. "Thought I'd make easy pickings. They were wrong. You should have taken the rifle." "I did." She tied off the last stitch and sat back, her hands trembling now that it was done. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't." She stared down at her lap. "You can't scare me like that again." "I didn't mean to. I know," she said softly. "That's what scares me." Zeke reached for her hand, calloused fingers closing over hers. "I don't want to be the reason you feel afraid." "You're not," she said, looking up. "Not anymore." That night she pulled her cot beside his. No words passed between them, just the warmth of shared breath, the hush of two people who had stopped running. In the morning she woke first and found him still asleep, one hand curled near her shoulder. She studied the lines of his face, the scar already fading along his cheek, and realized she hadn't thought about leaving in days. When he stirred, she leaned close. "Tell me true. Do you want me beside you for good?" Zeke didn't open his eyes. "I already built the room in my head. Then we'll build it on the ground next." Outside, the frost had melted, and the soil held the promise of something green. The walls of the new room rose slow under Zeke's hands, one board and beam at a time. By mid-May, the frame stood squared to the main cabin, roofline sloped to keep snow from pooling. Loretta helped where she could, hauling split pine, sanding edges smooth. She didn't speak much while they worked, but Zeke noticed how her eyes lingered on the doorframe each time she passed through it, as if measuring not just the shape, but the life now forming inside it. By the time the river softened and the deer came down to drink in the dusk, the room stood finished, bare but solid, with a window facing the western ridge. Zeke didn't say anything when he laid the quilt across the new cot, but Loretta did. "I don't want to sleep apart anymore," she said, brushing sawdust from her apron. "Not when we both lie awake waiting for morning." He didn't answer with words. He just took her hand and led her inside, days stretched quiet and full. Loretta stitched curtains from an old grain sack, dipped candles in the evening, and kept her books stacked near the hearth. Zeke rode out sometimes to check the line fence or water the far pasture, but he always came back before dark. She watched for his return without meaning to, caught herself listening for the sound of hooves on packed earth. One morning in late June, she found him standing by the stream, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the water. His rifle lay against a rock, untouched. "You tracking something?" she asked, stepping around the willow roots. "No," he said, "just thinking." She joined him, arms folded across her chest as she watched the water slide over stone. "About what?" "About planting more than just potatoes." She turned toward him. "You mean wheat," he nodded. "Could clear another acre behind the barn. If we start now, we'll have time before first frost." She looked at him for a long moment. "You really want to make this into something lasting?" "I already did," he said, watching her instead of the creek now. "The land's just catching up." Early July brought heat that clung to skin and air that held still. Zeke woke early to mend the well bucket, and Loretta took to rising before sunrise, pulling bread from the oven before the cabin grew too warm. One morning, as she swept the porch, a rider came up the trail. He wore a blue coat faded to gray and had a scar that cut deep through his brow. Zeke stepped out before the man dismounted. "You're far from Fort Bridger," Zeke said, resting a hand on the porch rail. The man gave a short nod. "Name's Ramsay. I'm looking for a woman who went missing from a ranch outside Rawlins." Bart Kelley filed a grievance with the sheriff's office. Loretta stepped down from the porch, her voice even. "I wasn't missing. I left when the contract was paid off." "Did you sign it?" Ramsay asked. "No. Then it wasn't binding, but Kelly's stirring up dust about stolen labor. Town wants it quiet, but if he presses, it could get loud." Zeke crossed his arms. "He sold her contract. You got the name on who paid it?" "I do," Ramsay said, pulling a folded page from his coat. "Says here, Zeke Kellan in full with witness. That should hold." Loretta didn't move. "Then why come all the way here?" "Because some men don't let go easy," Ramsay said, looking between them. "And I figured you ought to know he's riding this way come next week." Zeke's jaw tightened. If he comes, he'll leave empty. Ramsay gave a tired nod. Just be ready. After he rode off, Loretta stood beneath the porch beam staring down the trail. I'm not scared of him, she said. I know, Zeke replied. But I am angry he still thinks he can own what was never his. She looked up at him. I've been waiting my whole life to be free. I won't give that up, not even for peace. Zeke took her hand. You won't have to. They spent the next days in measured readiness. Zeke cleaned and loaded the rifle, sharpened the hatchet, fixed the latch on the barn door. Loretta packed a satchel with dried peaches, hard bread, and a coil of rope, not because she planned to run, but because she knew now that preparation was a kind of strength. The night before Kelley was due, they sat outside long after the sun had dropped, the lantern unlit. Crickets filled the silence. I never asked what you wanted, Zeke said. Not just from this place, but from me. She turned toward him, hands clasped in her lap. I want to wake beside you every morning and not wonder if I'll be left. I want to know that what we're building isn't just walls and crops, but a life with roots. That's what I want too. She looked at him, steady and sure. Then tomorrow doesn't change anything. No, he said, taking her hand. It doesn't. And inside the cabin, beneath the roof they'd raised together, they lay close without fear. Outside, the wind moved the grass in slow waves as if the earth itself were breathing, quiet and unshaken. The morning Bart Kelley rode up to the homestead. The sky hung low with gray, and the air carried the scent of damp pine. Zeke was already outside, splitting kindling near the fence line. Loretta stood at the cabin door, arms crossed over her apron, watching the single rider crest the bluff and descend at a deliberate pace. She didn't flinch. The past no longer had the power to reach her in the same way. Bart dismounted slowly and tied his gelding to the pine post without asking. His coat was cleaner than it had been months ago, but the same crooked set of his jaw remained. You've made yourself comfortable, he said, looking past Zeke toward Loretta. Didn't figure you'd settle for a patch of dirt with someone like him. Zeke didn't speak. He set the axe down and stepped forward, shoulders loose but steady. You rode far to say something no one here's asking to hear, he said. Bart's gaze flicked to the side of the cabin where the new room jutted out clean and square. I came for what I'm owed. You sold a contract for a woman's labor, Zeke said. You got your money, that debt's settled. She was spoken for. She was never yours, Loretta said, stepping from the porch, and you knew it. Bart's mouth twitched, but he didn't move closer. You think the law cares about what's right. You ran out on a legal arrangement. I didn't run. I left after you sold the paper. There's a difference. Bart's boots scuffed the dirt. Doesn't look like you're suffering out here. I'm not, she said. And I won't start today. Zeke shifted his weight. You want to ride into town and drag this through a court, go ahead, but you'll be wasting more than coin. You'll lose standing with every man who sees you for what you are, a liar who tried to make profit off someone's pain. Bart's jaw worked, but no words came. Unless you think you can take her back by force, Zeke added, voice quiet. Bart glanced at the rifle resting against the porch rail and the dog now standing just behind the barn, ears alert. He looked at Loretta last. You always think you're smarter than folks, he muttered. No, she said. I've just stopped letting anyone else decide what I'm worth. He hesitated, then turned, mounted, and rode out without a backward glance. They didn't speak for a while after he disappeared down the trail. The wind picked up, brushing tall grass in long, tired sways. Zeke walked to the porch, picked up the rifle, and leaned it back against the post. He won't be back. No, Loretta said. He won't. That evening they shared a supper of boiled greens and salt pork, the air inside the cabin warm with the burn of the stove. Zeke poured water into the tin basin, rolled his sleeves, and began washing up without a word. Loretta dried the dishes and stacked them neatly on the shelf. Later they sat outside, a blanket over their knees, the last of the daylight stretching long across the field. I never thought I'd see him again, she said, voice low. I hoped you wouldn't have to. She turned toward him. Thank you for standing beside me, not ahead, not behind. He looked at her, brow soft. That's the only way I know. She reached across the blanket, laced their fingers together. I've been thinking about the land, the garden, the new room. We've built all that, we have. I want to build the rest. Zeke studied her, then nodded once. Are you asking me to make it official? I'm telling you I mean to stay, not just here, with you. For good. He lifted her hand to his lips. Then I'll ask properly, tomorrow, at the ridge, at first light. She smiled, eyes shining in the dusklight. I'll be there. The next morning they stood on the rise above the stream where the pine trees thinned and the world opened wide. Zeke held out a ring made from a coin he'd hammered and shaped himself, edges worn smooth by his own hands. Loretta didn't cry. She only said yes, clear as the wind that carried across the valley. They married the following Sunday under the cottonwood tree behind the cabin. A traveling preacher from the valley read the vows, and 2 ranching neighbors served as witnesses. The dress Loretta wore was plain, but her smile lit the whole clearing. Zeke wore his cleanest shirt and held her hand like he'd never let it go. Afterward, they danced on the packed earth, no music but the rhythm of their boots and the laughter that rose like smoke. Years passed. The wheat field grew strong and the cabin stretched wider with time. Loretta taught herself to read maps and write letters, and she kept a ledger of what they grew and what they gave away. Zeke built a smokehouse, then a small barn, then a rocking chair that creaked when the wind turned east. They never spoke of Kelley again. There was no need. On warm nights, they sat on the porch with their shoulders touching, watching lightning bugs flicker above the grass. On cold ones, they read by lamplight or listened to the crackle of the stove. They grew older together, but never apart. Every day was a choice, and they kept choosing one another. And in all the silence, in all the small shared things, the worn handle of a kettle, the hush of footsteps on fresh snow, the way their hands always found each other in sleep, there was a peace that ran deep and lasting. A life earned, not given. A love built, not borrowed. They never wondered what might have been. They already had everything they needed.